We have the opportunity, the pleasure of hearing from Hudson Munoz. He's the executive director of Guns Down America, and someone I have the pleasure of calling a friend. He is the Guns Down America is a national advocacy organization that is dedicated to reducing gun violence by challenging social and economic forces that sustain firearms proliferation in the United States. Hudson brings a really, I think, different, a really distinct perspective to this work. It's really grounded in research, it's grounded in strategy. And before leading Guns Down America, he directed an effort at the Amalgamated Bank to establish a merchant category code for gun and ammunition stores. So, and that initiative was really aimed at helping financial institutions to better identify and address suspicious purchasing patterns that can be linked to illegal firearms use. Since his appointment as executive director in 2023, he has steered that organization towards uh, uh, different, sort of less politically motivated, less approaches and to gun advocacy work. Um, Sort of approaches that go beyond traditional policy debates. Under his leadership, Guns Down America has emphasized the commercial determinants of gun violence, including how corporate practices and market dynamics influence the demand for firearms, the supply for firearms. He's developed new research and advocacy tools to push for accountability for safer communities. And I don't know if I should say anything else about your background. I think that you have two master's degrees from Johns Hopkins. But anyway, like he's well qualified to be talking to you. I'm really happy to have him here, and I'll get out of your line of sight, but I'll see you.
I'll I'll move the camera so that he can at least see the room.
Okay, and
I would
thank you,
love to see the
Alexa.
room. I would love to see the room if that's possible, just for orientation purposes.
Yes, I will work on that, but why don't you go ahead and get started?
Um, Hello everyone. It's so nice to be with you. Thanks for making time today to come and listen to me talk. I will be the first to admit that the large presentation talking head thing, which in this case is my face on a giant screen, is even worse, is not my most natural format. So I hope that I can share what I share, and then we can have a conversation. Because when Topher and I first started talking about this, the title of the talk was What We Talk About When We Talk About Guns, a throwback to an old Raymond Carver novella, where a bunch of people drink a bunch of gin and talk about the meaning of love in their life at a dinner table somewhere outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I happen to have grown up. And I think Topher also has ties to Abiquiu, not too far up the road from where I was born. So, um, it will not surprise you, and I think you know as well as anyone, that what we talk about when we talk about guns has changed quite dramatically in the last 2 weeks. The definition and the way that people conceive of gun violence in the popular mind has changed as we've seen ICE agents in Minneapolis kill unarmed and one armed civilian in the streets in broad daylight. And that, as all things in gun violence in the United States, is the tragedy that moves the issue. So when Topher said that I chose to pick a lane for my organization that focuses on the commercial determinants and the economic conditions of demand for firearms and the relationship between the business of guns and outcomes in society, it was to the point of moving my organization away from an advocacy strategy that is fundamentally tied to mass tragedy, news cycle events, and incremental change on the order of 30 years or so. So that is the top lines of where we're going to go today. I hope that you will put questions questions in the chat, raise your hand. It's really, if you could help me sort of help the conversation along by just sharing what's top of mind as we go through today, I think it'll be a really rich afternoon. So, first, let me introduce myself. I'm Hudson Munoz. I started in this job about 2 years ago and spent the first little while building up a landscape of the issue space. Gun violence is outside of those news-driven events that typically are school shootings or mass shootings of some kind, a low salience and high polarization topic. People care when they care, but it's very hard to build up a movement around this outside of the ecosystem that exists. I would be surprised if in this room, you could name the 3 or 4 largest, well, I guess you are sort of socially conscious people at a socially conscious university, so maybe this is a bit of an anomaly. But there are some major organizations that have been in the field for a while, and I saw a need to change that a little bit in terms of the investment that our peers were making, the way that people allocate capital through philanthropies into the issue, and saw um, a clear gap in the way the problem is even conceived of that we could uniquely field because of my background, which I will tell some audiences is in business and business analysis, but like in truth, I got an MBA and then went and was like a PR flack at a bank for a while, which I don't think like qualifies me in any room to say I'm like a seasoned businessman who wanted to tackle the issue. It's more that I saw an opportunity in the issue that I felt like I had a unique skill set to address. Um, I don't know how much like the professional background stuff is interesting, so I'll just get into sort of the meat of the topic. I believe that gun violence is commercially determined. And what I mean by that is that the business of guns, from manufacturing to distribution to retailing, is causally linked to firearm injury and death outcomes. We say like that's sort of the wonky expression of the theory of change. To put it in more like salient jargony terms, um, incentives shape corporate behavior influences consumer behavior, which is a precursor to firearm injury and death outcomes. So, where our colleagues and peers at other organizations focus heavily on regulation that influences downstream use and access and regulation of firearms in individual hands, our objective at Guns Down America is to set a research agenda that ties business practice into firearm outcomes and looks at the levers around business activity in order to shape the outcome in terms of death, homicide, and injury. I'll give you an example of this in just a second. That's where we saw a gap in both the professional bench of people working in the space, where you have a whole lot of folks with policy expertise and Second Amendment expertise, but not a lot of folks with expertise in issues like securities law or contracts or competition policy, the factors that shape the business environment around the core problem as we conceive of it. And I've set out to build my analytical team and my advocacy team around those core competencies in order to advance the entire field. Um, where So that's like the theory of Guns Down America. That is our core value proposition. What we have done in the past has largely related to that. I inherited or sort of became executive director of this organization about 6 years into its life. And it was founded on the idea that if you could pressure corporate conduct would alter political outcomes. And my predecessor had a great deal of luck in that, mostly looking at the banking sector, where he was able to work with allies to change the ways that banks consider risk when lending to whether or not to lend into the firearms space, restrictions on lending for assault rifles or modern sporting rifles, to use their terminology for it, which took me as a consultant then to the project of creating the gun store merchant category code for standalone firearms retailers. And that core thesis is true today. Businesses have a responsibility to each other, and they have a responsibility to consumers, and they have a responsibility to the public. And we can use that responsibility in order to shift their conduct to align with our advocacy goals. As it relates to firearms outcomes in particular, one of the projects that I'm most excited about right now is the relationship between firearms retailing and firearm suicide. It's, on any given year, we can say with some degree of unfortunate certainty that on the order of 40,000 people will die from firearm injury in the span of the year. I think in previous years, sometimes it's been 46,000, sometimes it's 42, but we do seem to have achieved as a country some sort of very unfortunate stable trend where it's about 40,000 people plus a year, 50% of which are um, firearm suicides. And as a movement, we have not really, until very recently, taken seriously that problem. A lot of the investment in the advocacy space on the gun side of things, and the gun control or gun violence prevention side of things, has been much more towards homicide, criminal diversion, illicit networks, downstream use in interpersonal violence, those types of cases. And as a result, the policy and the regulations that have cropped up as a result of that advocacy don't really touch the suicide aspect of this problem. And I should apologize because usually before I go down this path, I issue a caveat that, I'm about to go down this path. But this is the path that we're going down, and I know it's a sensitive topic. Um, what we see in the data, and Topher, I'm going to give you a call pretty soon here because I'm getting lost in the statistical sauce and need to know if our methodology is right. Is that there are, outside of Walmart, five large firearms retailers. They are the big box stores that also have a license to sell firearms to the public. We can see very clearly in the data that when those stores set up shop in a new county, that the firearm suicide rate in subsequent years increases on the order of sometimes as much as 30% and then increases year over year on top of that. The question that we want to know, and this gets down to the title of the talk, what we talk about when we talk about guns, is what we talk about when we're talking about the relationship between a firearms business and its impact on society. And for me, and where we see the rubber hit the road in this, isn't just in the selling of guns, but in the merchandising activity, in the protocol that those stores place on the sales desk in terms of who they'll sell to, how they'll sell, what they cross-sell with. Are they selling out gun locks and gun safes? Are they selling out gun education? What is the risk mitigant at the sales counter that those stores can use in order to address the fact that they have an inherently risky business in an inherently risky area? And that's where I think our issue space is sort of returning to its early roots. People who worked on this issue in the 80s and in the 90s were extremely clear-eyed about the source of the problem. It was gun dealers and gun makers using the distribution network to move firearms around the country in order to meet what at the time they called illegitimate demand. What we're doing at Guns Down America is taking that history and those roots in the issue and giving them modern life by coming back to the question of what is the relationship between the gun industry and the rest of us who have to live with the problem that the business makes. That is, the only change between then and now is that Congress, in its infinite wisdom, passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act in 2005, which gave the gun industry, near blanket immunity for use of its products in, downstream cases, which curtailed a lot of work on the types of industry accountability stuff I'm talking about with you today. That's why we have been forced to not look at Gun Control Act issues, which regulate the sale of guns, but to look at the business law issues and the sales practices that don't have an implication in downstream use, but that still give us advocacy leverage over the businesses in order to advance our agenda. Let me stop there and see what you think. I see like maybe a couple of head nods or curious faces. But that's like Guns Down. That's what we do. That's why we think we will be successful in our theory of change. There's a hand in the back.
Yes, can you hear me all the way back from here?
I can, yeah.
Okay, hi, I'm David Kroc. I'm a faculty member. I had a question about the suicide rates. So you mentioned that the suicide rates go way up when a gun manufacturer starts selling in a new neighborhood. First, do the rates shift? So the total suicide rate stays the same, it's just that people change the method? Or does the suicide rate go up? And the reason I ask this is because there's an old study that I'd have to dig up about the transition in England from a generation of heat through coal, and that being the predominant way people committed suicide in England was carbon monoxide poisoning in their homes. And when they shifted from coal to gas, that became a much more difficult suicide method. And people did not switch from that method to another method of suicide. National suicide rates just went down, period. So I'm just curious about this relationship.
Yeah, so we are going through a falsification process to test our results against the general suicide rate in counties, which is the unit of analysis for our study. Preliminarily, what we see is that firearm suicide rates increase and increase as a proportion of the overall suicide rate in the county. So what our belief is that because of the increased socialization of firearms and the increased use and accessibility of firearms in those counties, both the suicide rate goes up and firearms become the predominant means or vector for suicide in the county. And it seems to be a durable feature. These products are designed for durability and long-term use. They're not a disposable item. And so once a retailer moves in and household firearm rates increase as a result of that, you now have a durable problem in that community that is very hard to pull out of and to extract yourself from.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, of course. It's like what are you a faculty in?
Restorative justice is my thing.
Okay. Okay. So that's going to be a big focus for us on the research and investment for this year. And as things come out, we will, pursue a strategy of escalating and methodologically escalating scrutiny of the businesses, beginning with very soft engagement and then moving to harder and more challenging tactics if we run into companies that are not willing to work with us on implementing top-down policy change as it relates to selling firearms. And this is, um, by the way, I've sort of often have said gun violence kind of exists in a bit of a triptych. On the one hand, you have daily violence in communities, largely an urban problem, largely a poverty problem, largely an issue of scarcity and illicit networks. And that's what we call the daily violence in the United States. And then there's mass violence. And this is why a lot of people get into the issue. It's school shootings, it's public violence in grocery stores or in churches. And then there's the politics of the issue on the third panel of this. And that's where we start to see in recent days real fault lines and a shift in public consciousness about their relationship to firearms and to gun culture in a way that I think is or has been in the offing, but has accelerated in the last few weeks as the Trump administration has reckoned with the fact that escalating authoritarian violence against an armed civilian population was predestined to involve firearm violence at some point. And I think people are very quick to put out statements and commentary on this, but we take it almost in like Arendtian terms that what the Trump administration is doing is gun violence. It is an illegal use of violence by people who happen to be federal officers against the population, not as another example of armed government action against the population in a way that may be lawful, though, clearly unjust in the case of, for example, police-involved shootings. And this is where I think the big trend line for the issue is going to be in terms of public debate and policy advocacy and the general small p politics of what it means to be in a country with a Second Amendment, is that there's going to be an expansion in consumer ideologies around firearms that creeps out of and spreads and normalizes away from right-wing ideological adherence to the Second Amendment into, what we're seeing preliminarily is into so-called, leftist or more progressive circles, historically marginalized or oppressed communities, whether it's the Black community or the LGBTQ community. Those folks are the most likely to now become first-time firearms owners. And in the shift of the consumer face of gun ownership, the demands around how those people relate to each other, and how they relate to advocacy and their demands on government when it comes to gun safety policies are also going to change. And this was, for a while, a bit of a monopoly on an ideology. The NRA, in its strongest form, controlled the rhetoric and the message and the expression of Second Amendment ideology out to people in a way that kind of hedged against the most extreme and also satisfied people who were, genuinely gun curious or firearms enthusiasts who were willing to tolerate the more extreme position in order to participate in the organization. That's no longer the case. And I think one of the big challenges my field is going to have, and because it's America and we live in a very permissive firearms environment, we're all going to have, is what do we do as individuals when our neighbors who we, know and love and trust suddenly become firearms enthusiasts who are like scared of you as they were of the NRA previously. And it's very, very hard um, to separate the product and its effect on people's mindsets as it is from the outcomes of firearm injury and death. And that is going to be a big problem coming forward into 2026 and 2027 as this sort of toxic Trump environment animates interest in firearms ownership.
Hudson, I don't know if you can see, but that corner does have a couple questions. Sorry.
Nope, can't see.
Sorry. Um, thank you for this. You were just making a very important point. This is not to distract from that. I was talking to some friends in Minneapolis, and they had heard, or someone else had overheard, one of the agents saying, "Oh, this is just like Call of Duty, the video game." And I was wondering about sort of the culture of violence and sort of the normalization, and I don't know, maybe there are even connections of, I don't know if gun manufacturers or whatever are funding some of these games or some of the backing, but yeah, anything you know about the video game industry around this, or other cultures of violence that are pockets that are perpetuating and encouraging this.
Yeah, the video game thing has been like a live debate since I was a teenage boy and I wanted to play violent video games. And my mom said, "You can't play violent video games until you're out of my house." And then I left the house and I was like no longer into it. So it sort of dodged that problem in like a micro sense. But what I do know factually is that firearms makers, I think Remington in particular, paid the designer of Call of Duty to place their guns in the video game. And their goal there is, and look, like if you haven't taken a business class, I recommend everyone take like a marketing class because it explains so much of like the how the world is designed for us. But their explicit intention in placing the product in the video game was to move young men into the sales funnel. They want to get people normalized to, so like setting aside like the outcome of like do video games make people violent or increase school violence? TBD on that one. But I do know that when you create a sales funnel, it's a staircase of engagement that is meant to get that person to transact with the company. And in Call of Duty and in video games, on Instagram, in other places where there is a very sort of unbranded marketing experience for young people around guns, the goal is to get them interested in the product as the first step, to engage with the culture around the product as a second step, to form a consumer ideology around what it means to be an owner. And by that, I mean hunter, marksman, tactical shooter, and the cultural accoutrement around it. In the case of like the tactical shooter, what we're talking about is flak jackets and knives and like, black gear, things that are sold alongside the product that is meant to satisfy their demand not just to own a gun, but to embody a lifestyle. And then you can't buy a gun until you're 18, but what you can do is generate demand among young people so that when they turn 18, when they turn 19, when they have means to do it, they're able to go out and satisfy this long-term craving for a product. We also know, this has kind of been I guess I should say, we don't know, but here's my hypothesis, and if someone can test it, please test it and let me know what you find. That firearms, we know that firearms are like concentrated. So it is true that there are verging on 1.2 guns for every person in the country. I think 400 and some million guns for a population of 330 million people. But not everyone owns a gun. In fact, most of those firearms are concentrated in about two-thirds of the population. And even among that, the ownership is highly concentrated in certain households. And my thesis is that looking at the consumer journey, the time from 0 to 1 is long. It might take months or even years if we're talking about young men to buy their first firearm. The time between 1 and 2 is short relative to 0 to 1. The time between 2 and 3 is short relative to 1 to 2. The time between 3 to N is short relative to the preceding steps in that acquisitive consumer behavior. And then it is especially long to go from N back to 0. In that case, what you're talking about, it may be a firearms buyback, or it might be a generational transfer. Some gun collector passes away and leaves the arsenal to the family, thereby technically going from, N to 0, but the family going from 0 to N in that particular hypothetical. The point being is that that kind of consumptive behavior is encouraged, and that type of consumptive behavior is inherently dangerous, especially from a mass violence perspective, where you have high concentrations of firearms in socially fragmented environments leading to gun violence, which is a special case of general violence in society. I forgot what got me on that particular kick. Oh, the Call of Duty example. Yeah. I mean, look, like what that is the channel that they want people to be in. It's really in like the most abstract sense, not that different from, I mean, you're on a college campus, right? So you probably have banks, or at least when I was in college and it was, the first day of freshman year, the local banks would set up a stand and they would say, come open your checking account, right? And they want you to come and deposit your, little bit of money and form a relationship with the bank. And then the bank, as you get older and have more means, they say, here's a credit card, here's a mortgage, here's a home equity line of credit. It's or in the context of cars, um, Honda has a product that's meant to satisfy every part of someone's life journey. They have the Honda Fit for the college student, and then the Honda Civic for the young professional, and then the Accord for like the pre-family yuppie, and then the van for like the van stage of life, and then the sports car for when you're, ready to retire. That's exactly what the gun industry is doing. They create a product that's meant to match to a particular version of demand, except that they kind of do it in sort of a shitty way. If you go and read like the earnings call transcripts for Smith and Wesson or Sturm Ruger, um, they will talk about product innovation and how they're matching product to demand and the inventory matrix and makeup as a way to optimize the value of the company. But what they're really talking about is like, are they bluing the steel? Are they putting wood on the handle? And how much does the gun weigh? Like my favorite example of this is just sort of like an indicator of how far they will go in order to put guns in people's pockets at a time when demand is falling to historic lows. There was, I forget which company, I think it was Smith and Wesson, talked about releasing a new pistol that was small and light in order to um, take advantage of the elderly female market, right? So they're saying people as they age have like weaker tendons and muscle strength in their hands, and so we need to sell them like a tiny little pistol in order to, move our margins to where they need to be by quarter's end. It's if it wasn't such a horrible impact, I mean, you could look at this company and create a sitcom about like the poorly conceived consumer product experience. But it's not unlike those others. They are trying to, but they have built a world in which we live in, and now they are trying to optimize the value of their strategy.
Yeah, there's another question over in the
Sorry,
corner.
one more. This is fascinating, actually. I think it's really interesting, and I have 4 boys who all wanted to play Call of Duty growing up, and I didn't let them either, so this is how they are doing good things now, but I'm really struck by what you brought about, the suicide rates, I mean, for gun violence. And that just hits home, you know, for me and communities that I live in, and I also am really struck how you talked about the marginalized people being first-time gun owners, and so everything from LGBTQ to Black, you know, like all, you know, immigrants, you name it. That is just really fascinating to me, and what's interesting to me is that those groups, at least ones that I'm aware of, who have the highest suicide rates are the marginalized people, and a lot of the deaths that I've been aware of have been through gun, you know, they put their lives with a gun. And I'm more familiar with the LGBTQ world just because of family member and just how that's impacted a lot of communities where I live. But so I think that's fascinating. I'd love to see more about the rates on that. But you also mentioned, you know, here we have federal agents and police gun violence that's also violence, right? So with those rates of all these different kind of violence, like the suicide, I forget what you called it, for regular everyday violence.
Daily.
Yeah, how do the federal agents, police, how do those rank as well? Is there a percentage of how much they take up of some of the violence that we have happening in our country right now? I don't know if that can be broken down. If gun violence used by federal or, you know, official people, whether justified or not, how those rank in all these things along with suicides and everyday violence and those, anyway, just curious about that, where they weigh in. It's a large number.
It's not as big as the other numbers, and I gotta confess, like before last weekend, I did not think that my organization was going to contend with the problem of like authoritarian violence on the population. You know, I just that to me was like still in the realm of speculative and not unfounded or unforecasted, but just kind of like I did not think that was going to like hit the issue so quickly and so fast as it did. And so I'm frankly I'm not super read up on it because I thought that like if anyone was going to deal with state violence, like the ACLU had that covered, and I had my sort of my hands full with these other issues. But because of the cultural reverberations of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, like I don't think we have the luxury of setting that aside anymore and saying someone else has it covered. And maybe it was a bit of like a feint on my part to dodge that to begin with because it is legally complex, but it is morally obvious exactly what is happening when it comes to ICE agents being recruited at gun shows, given guns, and then sent out on an oppressive agenda. Like I don't know. It's like it's pretty front and center now. The historical statistics on that, I don't know. I do know that police involved shootings are tracked by different advocacy groups and government agencies. But I frankly just sort of set that aside, and I'm not familiar enough to speak to it.
I have a question for you, Hudson. This is Topher. I heard you speak before about suicide rates, so I'll be happy to get into the econometrics of it or whatever with you. But I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, it's so on the homicide side, the side of the ledger, it's so easy to sort of make some political hay. And I imagine for an organization, you know, so many organizations that don't have guns down America's focus, like whether it's Brady or Everytown or whatever, they try to mobilize after every shooting. And it's clear to the American public that like whether it's Pulse or if it's the First Baptist Church or like whatever the, you know, Sandy Hook, wherever it is, it's a guns problem, or at least that like everybody has a debate the inevitable debate as to whether it's a guns problem. But I guess I'm wondering, what's the groundwork that you have to do on the suicide front to convince people that this too is a guns problem, and like we wouldn't all just be like, pulling a Sylvia Plath and sticking our head on it or something like otherwise, right? That this is I'm sorry, I did not mean to make light of suicide, but like that it's a gun, that this too is a gun issue.
No one's really done it successfully. Ironically, the last group that tried to do it was the American Society for Suicide Prevention, set up a partnership with the National Shooting Sports Foundation. The National Shooting Sports Foundation is a bit like the NRA in Suits. They are the lobby group for the big gun manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and they come across as, by design, rhetorically very civil. But you sort of scratch the surface of their policy positions and realize that they've just sort of put a business shine on the same core policy ideas that the NRA made, untold political gains out of. They signed an MOU with the American Society for Suicide Prevention to stand up a partnership between retailers and ASSP in order to do some programming around it, and it was sort of a famously a major flop. They had no measurable outcomes. Um, this is like for the first time. I mean, people talk about suicide, but to my knowledge, coming from a gun violence prevention advocacy organization, the first time we're trying to make inroads on that half of the problem as measured by the rates. Um, I have some ideas about why I think it would be successful. For one, the typology is fairly uniform in suicide versus homicide and other interpersonal violence outcomes, making it easier to identify and scale solutions, which sounds so jargony, but like I do mean it. Like when the typology is the same and the solution matches the typology, you're going to have an opportunity to like apply that more widely versus an interpersonal case where you have certain typologies that don't relate to each other. So there's that part of the promise. The other part of the promise is that we're talking about large corporate chains. The five retailers that we've identified in the study as the largest ones in the country, setting aside Walmart, span, I would say, 1,000 retail outlets in some of like the highest risk portions of our country, the Rocky Mountain West and Appalachia, kind of Missouri up to Western Pennsylvania. That gives us a chance to influence, not one store at a time, but to influence an entire corporate chain that's interacting with these high risk populations on a daily basis. And I also think that there's more of like an articulated and stronger, more extant social contract between retailers and individuals when it comes to suicide, where there is a sense of obligation to the community that doesn't exist or that is eroded or questioned when a firearm is then used for a criminal purpose, because it becomes more diffuse down the chain, the relationship between the responsibility of the retailer and the responsibility to the individual versus the retailer and the individual and the impacted person or community on the other side in the case of interpersonal violence. So, it is, I have a way of saying that, like, since I became executive director, like a way of choosing the hard path. And that is everything from like the rebrand to the content strategy to the research agenda. Like, there was definitely an easier way to do this. But, you know, if it was easy, someone else would have done it, and someone has to go first. And we see innovation on the interpersonal violence side of things. Groups like Nina Vinnick's Project Unloaded that are looking not just at supply side solutions, the way I am when it comes to suicide, but demand side, culture change, mindset work in young populations, youth populations from impacted communities that's really needed and hasn't been done. And I'm super glad she's going first in that space because she's got a propensity to measure and iterate on things that work. So, that's all to say, I don't know yet. But I ain't too scared of trying.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Excuse me. My name's Alejandrex. I work here at the Kroc School. I'm curious about the demographics of those who have died by suicide that are showing the data. Like, could you tell me who? I know you said it increases when there's a, oh, you froze, and now you're back. So I'm not sure if you heard my question, but I'm curious on the demographics of those who have died by suicide currently. Um, if you could share those with us, because I'm thinking about the current state of our country, of the world, and I'm thinking about loneliness and belonging. And what does owning a gun make you belong to? And so if there's an increase, a potential increase of marginalized communities purchasing guns, what are they going to belong to? Yeah, so there's some connection here, and I'm not sure if you could help me draw it out.
So there absolutely is. I would argue that firearms are like firearms and firearms ideologies are accelerate the atomization of the individual in the United States, by which I mean the ideas that come along with firearms ownership lead to isolation inherently, because what it says is fear your neighbor and arm yourself. You can't trust your government and you can't trust your society to protect you. And this is where you get very dangerous ideas in individuals about their role as a firearms owner in terms of effectuating their view of justice and imposing it on the world. And that is an isolating mindset. I will address your question, but let me just speak to a related point. Because um, in the Black community, in the LGBTQ community, in other marginalized community, the Jewish community, the Asian American community, there is a different view on gun ownership than traditionally we see in right-wing and mainstream American gun owning circles. And that comes from the idea of community defense. Um, the idea that we have to protect because of the experience of oppression and the experience of marginalization, there's more of a baked in sense of obligation to one another in some of these communities. And so firearms ownership doesn't become quite so individually isolating as it becomes we need to have guns because they have guns in order to protect this idea of our community from an outside threat. I still think it is inherently dangerous because when you have a gun in the home, and we know, for example, that in the trans community, suicide rates are generally much higher than they are in the average American household. Access is one of the steps in the suicide typology. Ideation, access, it means access, and then end use. That path becomes more accessible as firearms become more prevalent, even in places where the ownership isn't an individual protection, but an idea that's related to community defense. So, to answer your underlying question, which is what do we see in terms of where the firearm suicide effect is most prevalent, it's it's rural communities, communities with a high concentration of firearms retailers, a high concentration of veterans, and places that are food insecure. And the picture that emerges to me out of this is, um, you know, hungry, isolated people without opportunity are at a greater risk of suicide generally. And then you add in the merchandising effect of a firearms retailer and get that very, very tragic outcome of increased suicide rates in those locations. Geographically, what we're talking about is, again, Appalachia from Arkansas, Missouri up to western Pennsylvania, and then sort of on either side of the Rocky Mountain Range. And my hypothesis there, which we're sort of testing out still, is that at least in the Rocky Mountain area, the highest concentrations of firearm suicide are typically on Native American reservations, where those you see high incidences of drug and alcohol death rates, extreme poverty, rural and social isolation as a result of economic disenfranchisement, precipitating firearm suicide when the availability is there by virtue of the FFL.
My name's Raphael. I'm curious, like, how much have you or like people you work with in like this issue have like looked at other countries as I mean, like comparing and contrasting gun culture, gun laws, and so on, like in other nations?
Yeah.
Like one country that comes to mind is Switzerland that has like probably like a very high gun ownership rate, but is like extremely low as far as gun violence. That is one example. You know, there are many others. But I'm just curious, like how much, if at all, like do you look at like just as a like comparing and seeing like what you can take away from other nations?
Yeah. So, Topher, you'll be glad you didn't cut it off because I'm about to give a plug to your paper, Modeling the Firearms Industry 2018 to 2023, which talks about the policy instruments that affect the upstream drivers for demand for guns. So we do talk about, I mean, you can't avoid it in the issue. You know, there was a shooting in Australia the same weekend that there was a shooting at Brown University. And within the span of a week, they had all gotten together and said, this is not our country. We're going to do something about it. And what I often hear, same thing, you know, Sweden, European countries that have higher ownership rates and lower incidences of violence. And I think there's a bit of, and this would create a bit of controversy if I brought it up at some conferences, but here's my honest take on this. It is true that those countries have greater degrees of firearms regulation and requirements for training and permitting and all of that kind of stuff. And they have bans on certain types of products that are inherently more dangerous than others, for example, in Australia. But I think that underneath that, we also hear, before I get to the underneath part, in addition to like the increased regulation of the product, we also hear from, you know, people who observe the issue that those are relatively more homogenous societies in terms of, you know, race and mindset. And I think there's a whole lot to unpack there. But what I don't see discussed is that those countries have robust welfare states. They take care of their people. Like you can go to college. If you're unemployed, you have options. Healthcare is socialized. And I think that that element of demand, which is virtually absent in the United States, except in like the most poorly designed ways, has an effect on the downstream outcomes. And this is where we see a little bit of an advocacy opportunity in terms of tax policy, because, and this is where it connects with Topher's paper, that if you want to affect demand for firearms, what you really need to look at are welfare policies that treat for education, healthcare, economic opportunity, and solve the underlying problem of crime, which in a society that has a high rate of firearms is going to convert to gun crime. So I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to not look country by country and do those types of comparisons, but look country by country in terms of what the welfare opportunities and policies are in those places versus the United States, even on a state by state basis, and say, what can we do way far upstream of the problem to address the outcome of daily gun violence? I hope that answered that. I mean, that was a bit of a ramble, but that's so I should say, my email address is hudson@gunsdownamerica.org. I'm always happy to talk with folks who have an interest or want to learn more or explore an idea. So if you have lots more questions or just want to talk one-on-one, you should send me an email and we'll set up time, or you can bother Topher and he'll give you my contact information. I'm happy to do it. I don't think we do enough of this kind of stuff, frankly. There's like generally, I think, a high level of curiosity, some baseline, general understanding that this is not right, that we don't have to live like this, and then a lot of questions about the complexity of the issue and how it boils down to what the solutions actually can be. And that's where I feel, as Guns Down America, we're trying to say, like, this is the specific thing. If a firearms retailer offers off-site safe storage so that people can leave their gun at the store and not take it home where their kids are going to have it, or their partner who has a substance abuse problem is going to have access, that will have an immediate and measurable effect on outcomes. And I think we all I was recently at a meeting and we all sat around. We were like, what are we going to do about gun violence? And I thought to myself, if the gun industry knew that we were talking about political solutions to a commercial problem, they would love the fact that we all spent a day with a chinwag on like gun politics and not on the commercial determinants of gun violence. And I think that's where people start to throw up their hands and say, what is the political solution? And I do think that this is inherently a political problem because gun ownership is about how we view each other, our relationship to each other, and how we view our relationship to the government. And that's a political problem. But in the meantime, before we have to change like all the hearts and the minds to make that political problem a legislative solution or a legal solution or an executive branch investment, we can address these things that have scale on a 1 to 5 year timeline by applying pressure as individuals to the businesses that are the upstream driver of what we experience as gun violence.
I am so grateful for your time. This was amazing. Thank you again, Hudson.
Thank you all very much. Please reach out. Again, hudson@gunsdownamerica.org. I'm happy to talk anytime.
All right. Yeah. And I'm happy to so link people up to you. All right. Thank you so much. We'll connect later. Okay.
Bye, everyone.